Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PATH Live Forum. We're just letting people join, so if you just give us a couple of minutes, we'll get started right away. Thanks. Okay, everybody, hello. We'll get started now. I think we have a lot of people on the call today and looks like more joining, but we shan't wait. So welcome to the PATH Live Forum. I'm Elaine Gibbons. I'm the Vice President of Global Engagement and Communications at PATH. And I'm delighted to be having this conversation today with Dr. Nancy Bristow, who's a Professor of History at the University of Puget Sound here in Tacoma. In the Puget Sound region. Thank you all very much indeed for joining. Just a couple of quick housekeeping reminders. Many of you who have joined us before will know this very well. If you've got questions, please submit them in the chat box. We will moderate them and get them answered as quickly and as appropriately as we can. Those that we can't answer, we would like to offer to respond to after, and so we will keep all of the questions and endeavor to get back to people or create some content that will answer those questions. If you're a social media junkie, you can tag us at PATH Tweets or join the conversation online at PATH Live Forum. So many of you are familiar with PATH, so I won't belabor this, but as you all know, we are a global team that is dedicated to achieving health equity, and never has that been more important than now. We want all communities and people to thrive. So together, we drive health solutions that meet the most pressing needs of families, communities, and countries. We do that all over the world and through a variety of mechanisms. So if we move to the next slide, we'll show you those. That's vaccines, diagnostics, drugs, devices, and health systems. And we do that globally. So if we go to the next slide, we work in 70 countries around the world, and the majority of us are from the countries where we work. So our global staff drives a great deal of that work. So thank you again for joining us today. Thank you to our supporters, our donors and partners. This is not a fundraising event, but as always, we really appreciate your support, particularly in uncertain times, which we are most certainly in. So before I pass over to Dr. Bristow to introduce herself, I did want to sort of note this is not quite the normal conversation, not quite our usual topic, but PATH is a learning organization, and understanding the past to inform the future is a critical element of innovation and affecting large-scale change. So both of those things are crucial to PATH's global public health agenda. And there's no doubt we're at an instructive moment for understanding how we can behave differently as a society to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. I was lucky enough to hear Dr. Bristow on Hidden Brain, which is, as many of you who know me, know Shankar Vedantam, and Hidden Brain is one of my favorite radio shows and podcasts. And I was so thoroughly impressed with her perspective and her focus on equity, race, and public health that I immediately emailed her, thinking that our partners and supporters would find her historical perspective and her anchoring in equity really interesting. So here we are. And welcome, Nancy. Perhaps I can ask you to give us a little bit of background about your area of expertise and your academic discipline, and then we'll get into why you wrote the book and some of the main themes of the book. So welcome, Nancy. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you so much, Elaine and Path, for having me. It's an honor to be with all of you. So I'm an historian by trade. I think I came to it because I was raised up in the 1960s and early 1970s, and it was a world that didn't make a lot of sense to me. And when I took a history course in college, suddenly I saw the possibility of a lens that I could use that might help me understand why, frankly, the world I lived in made so little sense, did not resonate with many of my values, with many of the expressed values I heard around me. And so being a child of that era, I was terrified to study that time period initially. So I turned to the First World War, another era in which the world was in desperate chaos, in which warfare was causing terrible losses around the globe. And I was very interested in a number of questions about how the status quo was being challenged in that era and the ways in which the relationship between the state and the citizen was being rearranged and debated. And then that reform work was interrupted by war. And for me, that very much is a parallel of sorts to the 1960s and 70s, which is also a tremendous interest. I was interested, especially though, in the voices of those people who don't necessarily turn up in a traditional history textbook. I'll describe them as the people whose names we may not know, but who nevertheless were living full lives. Lives as complex and intricate as our own. And so doing social and cultural history, I gradually gravitated in turn also to African American history. And that's something I've been teaching for 30 years at the University of Puget Sound. As Toni Morrison, the great writer, told all of us at one point, to try to understand American history without African American history is incoherent. You simply cannot do so. And so more recently, my work has turned to a really focused emphasis on this later period, the 1960s and 70s. And my most recent book, which came out last month, Steeped in the Blood of Racism, investigates a police shooting, unfortunately, 50 years early or 50 years ago. And my interest there is in the causes, the rhetoric that was used to defend the shootings, and the process of forgetting, all of which were bound up with white supremacy. And so I have become, in a sense, a historian of social cataclysm. And that's, in a sense, why the influenza pandemic, which sort of sits between my first and my most recent book, came to pass.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Nancy. And that interest and focus really comes through even in this book. And I must say, I'm going to show it so that people can see the book that I'm referring to. But it really, it reads like a novel, but it's researched like a textbook. And I really appreciated the way you put the narrative together and the depth of the content and the research. But it's clear that that equity and lens of equity and anti-racism is clear in your writing. So maybe we could just jump right in. There's several themes in this book, but I'd love to talk a little bit about why you started to write this one. Clearly, historians have been in agreement that the epidemic of influenza was one of the great forgotten episodes of American history. And while it was memorialized in stats that were produced by technically advanced countries, other authors whom you cite in the book note that it never inspired awe, not in 1918 and not since. And so Americans simply forgot the disaster of the influenza pandemic. I think the reason you chose to write this book is in part very closely connected to that theme of a national forgetting. Could you talk about how you came to this book in particular and your personal family story? and what prompted you to write the book?
I can. So I had long had an interest in the pandemic, but precisely because it had been kind of publicly forgotten, there wasn't much written on it. So I sort of moved past. And then 1995, I'm on a backpacking trip with my father near Mount Hood down in Oregon. And somehow in the conversation, it emerges that my dear beloved grandfather, John, who I had known really well as a child and had known that he had been orphaned, that the cause of that had been the flu pandemic of 1918. And I was simply floored because this was such an important global event that I knew almost nothing about. And what we did know about that global event had mostly to do with how it affected the Paris peace talks. Did Woodrow Wilson get sick or not? These kinds of questions that involved, royalty or political figures. But the world that my grandfather had been in, his parents had been in, was not a world that was available for me to access. So my grandfather, John Bristow, was 15 when he lost his parents. His mother sickened quickly and died of pneumonia, which was a common aftermath of the influenza. During the funeral, his father began to fall ill. And 4 days after he lost his mother, he also lost his father. So here he was, a 15-year-old, an orphan and an adult overnight, literally. What did that mean for him? What was that like? What did that then open up and close for him in terms of pathways through his life? What was it like to be in his neighborhood when that was happening? There were no resources to tell me that had been written by scholars, but those resources were there. And so I went out on I would argue with a bit too much hubris, but with the idea that I could somehow rebuild that world for myself and come to understand my grandfather's experiences by understanding the experiences of other people like him, working class people, living in urban centers, living all over the country, but again, people whose names wouldn't be in the history textbooks, but who nevertheless suffered through this horrific event.
Mm-hmm. And that comes over very strongly in the book. I think that really, as I mentioned, helps the narrative seem so easy and well connected to you. There are a lot of themes in the book, and we'll focus on a few: economic and racial inequity, role of government, media, and depending if we have time, some others, but also in particular this theme of remembering the national and personal experience and how different they were. Can we start with the effects of the wealth gap? We're clearly now in a recession, and by all accounts, we'll see a major slowdown in global growth. That's certain to exacerbate current financial insecurity, especially for marginalized groups. What was the impact of the wealth gap in the 1918 pandemic?
Well, I'm afraid it's just what you can imagine from what we've been watching with this pandemic, which is those who are most disadvantaged, those who are most marginalized, those who already lack resources, suffered in terrible, terrible ways. First of all, they would suffer with a much higher likelihood of getting ill simply because of the conditions in which they lived and worked. So if you live in a crowded tenement, you cannot isolate yourselves from your neighbors or from the other 9 people who live in a single room apartment, for instance. So the likelihood of becoming ill because of poor housing, the reality that they would go into the illness already with a less healthy body because of lack of good nutrition, perhaps lack of access to good water. So again, also the absence of good public health education for those who are poor, for those who perhaps didn't speak English and were living in this country. So a higher likelihood of getting sick. And then in turn, the suffering that they would go through once ill, I think simply cannot be overstated. So imagine again, a poor family, and it could be a rural family or an urban family, but living in a situation in which they already have insufficient resources, that when someone becomes sick, they don't have those resources available to take good care. They cannot hire a private nurse to come in and help. They cannot necessarily provide the kinds of comfortable settings in which a person who is already ill could be taken care of and have access to enough warmth and to good water and again to appropriate food. So just the suffering itself, there are horrific Red Cross accounts of entire families being in a single room with many people or everyone in the family sick, nothing to eat, no one there to care for them, and perhaps even people who have already passed away still in the household. Again, because without resources, the capacity to do that caregiving from beginning to end was simply made so much more difficult.
Mm-hmm. And presumably the there's a real breakdown across the racial divide around within that wealth gap. That, if I recall correctly, you talked about the race riots in 1919 and how that had a little impact on the white belief that economic opportunity was open to all, and that perhaps that sort of prevailing white view helped the pandemic continue to pass from public attention. Is that right? Was it, just talk a little bit about the difference between being poor and white and poor and black?
Well, if you already go into a pandemic poor, and then you add into it the issues of race in the United States at that historical moment, you're dealing with a segregated healthcare system. Life expectancy for white Americans in 1915, so just a few years before the pandemic, is 55.1. For African Americans, it's 38.9. That's a 16-year life expectancy difference before the pandemic strikes. So you can imagine that this access to adequate healthcare and to healthcare resources and to other sort of basic resources really did matter in terms of the health of people going in. And that system that was producing those inequitable outcomes prior to the pandemic are only reinforced with the pandemic. So segregated hospitals where African Americans might have access to an emergency hospital that was opened in the pandemic, but be asked to go to the basement, to crowded quarters, for instance, as was done in the city of Richmond. Or in Philadelphia, the city opened several emergency hospitals for the white community, did not open a single hospital for the Black community. It was left, in fact, to a leading local African-American physician to open an annex to his own hospital to care for those citizens who could not get into the already overcrowded Black hospitals in the city. So those problems that pre-exist the pandemic are only reinforced. And again, poverty is then intersected with race to create really horrific conditions for the Black community.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we'll talk specifically then about race. I mean, what's so interesting, and we'll get to this a little bit more, but what's so interesting is how similar these experiences are to today, and you know, clearly many of these same conversations are happening today. We've seen certainly some early messaging around the fact that we were sort of all in this together. And while there is a common experience, I think it's really clear to many, particularly in the global health space, that's simply not the case, whether you're in the US or elsewhere. Can you talk about the difference of experience among the populations in the pandemic, particularly maybe indigenous populations?
In 1918, absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, you're dealing with similar kinds of problems. So I'll give a really simple example. A young woman named Edith Potter, an indigenous woman from California who had been shipped off to one of those horrific Indian boarding schools about a month before the pandemic strikes. She's in good health, is checked into the school, and then in mid-October is stricken with the flu and will die in 2 days. She's separated from her mother by hundreds of miles. Her mother is not allowed to get the body to bring home to do proper burial rites. The school where this child was, Edith Potter, was the Chemawa Indian School in Salem, Oregon. It was already a hotbed of illness for the indigenous children for reasons that are obvious: poor care, mistreatment, inadequate food, inadequate clothing, and again, essentially psychological torture. And so again, here is a group of young children already suffering because they're indigenous. And then when the pandemic strikes, it hits the school very, very hard. And that's true for indigenous communities around the country as well, where they also suffer from a basic, how can I put it? They were neglected prior to the pandemic. And when the pandemic strikes, their own traditions are absolutely disregarded. And so they're disrespected and mistreated by public health officials then once the pandemic hits. So the suffering is not only the physical suffering of a pandemic, but also the sort of cultural genocide, as well as the sort of psychological punishment that they would go through in the midst of the pandemic. And tragically, of course, we're seeing similarly really high death rates with COVID-19, not only in the indigenous communities, but the Black and Brown communities as well.
Yeah, and did you, you know, it's clear that disruptive moments such as these can often shake up social norms. These experiences are evident maybe only in pockets of the community, which is part of your point, obviously. But did the 1918 pandemic shake up social norms? My reading from your book says it did not. That you talk extensively about how Americans stuck to their established norms, and it didn't create significant change. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly, as we've already talked about, the poor were still treated as poor people and were often mistreated, for instance, by social workers who would come to their homes and pass judgment on whether they were worthy or unworthy of charitable giving. And so similarly, the African-American community and other communities of color suffered continuously from segregation during the pandemic. Why is that? Well, I think one thing that's going on, and I think we are all experiencing this now, is in the midst of this social chaos, you're sort of grasping for something that feels familiar and safe. And for those who are in power, those hierarchies of the society and of the culture are of great comfort. And so this epidemic in 1918 was wreaking a kind of social chaos that, again, I think is somewhat familiar, but just to give people a sense of what was going on, the nation had already been at war for 16 months at this point. So we have 4 million young men that have been taken off to war, 2 million of them off to the front. This disease strikes quickly. So over the course of 2 months, the entire world is encircled with the flu. It has an extraordinarily high morbidity rate. So about a third of people worldwide, something like 500 million people are infected with this. Within the United States, it's more like a quarter, so about 25 million Americans. Has a high mortality rate. So if seasonal flu traditionally in the United States kills 0.1%, this had a mortality rate of 2.5%. So again, a very deadly disease as well. And then finally, it was killing healthy young adults. So when you think about how destabilized people would have felt, how terrifying this would have been, imagine if 50% of the victims of COVID-19 were between the ages of 20 and 40. And that's what happened in 1918. So you're talking about parents and school teachers and firefighters and business people, those very people who we think of as kind of running our society for us. That's who is dying. And so in the midst of this, those with power really grabbed hold of that which was familiar. And what was familiar was, unfortunately, racism, white supremacy, traditional gender norms, class discrimination. And so I think it's a real cautionary tale for us in 2020 to recognize the ways in which we may also be doing very much the same.
Mm-hmm. And I'd love to dig in a little bit more to some of the attitudes among the aid workers and the public health professionals, where they misdirected culpability for that disparity to the victims, not the system, and judge people for being poor. It's so interesting, even just this morning on a call with my colleague, Dr. David Fleming, who's a well-established long-term public health expert here in Washington State and at PATH, runs our global health programming. He noted the very same issue still is today, that the statistics that we look at are often reflecting issues at the individual level, not statistics that are reflecting the systemic challenges. And we need to start to look at the data differently in order to affect a different outcome. And so it really struck me that was the same issue that we were working through in 1918. Can you reflect on that?
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. And it's one of the things that I have found most disturbing, doesn't even do it justice, terribly depressing, unsettling, and frankly enraging is the ways in which we're seeing this replayed, which is in 1918, people were very much judged for who they were. So if an aid worker came to a poor family's home, and that home might be a single room in a tenement house, let's say, has no windows because it's a tenement house. It's probably very dirty because access to water might be 6 floors down. Perhaps everybody in the family is working. Aid workers would go to that home and then critique the very people who were suffering under the problems of being poor, the things that poverty does to a family, inadequate resources, the inability to maintain health standards that they might have chosen to maintain, but simply found impossible in the context of the difficulties that they faced simply being poor. In turn, if you were from another country, you might not speak English, you might be practicing Catholicism or Judaism, and that again would bring a whole nother layer of critique that you weren't behaving appropriately. Perhaps you came from a culture that drank alcohol. Well, there again is a whole nother problem. I read an account, for instance, of a family. It was an unmarried family, the parents, and the child was removed from them because they were not married. They had asked for aid because they had influenza in the household, and what resulted was a child was taken away for 6 months. The family was broken up. The woman essentially married someone else so she could be married and get her child back. So this sort of judgment about why you're sick and what you deserve to have was so viewed through cultural lenses that were discriminatory and uncaring. And when you think about the Black community, again, this is the area I know the best, and surely there are stories like this that could be told about Latino communities, that can be told about Indigenous communities, about Asian American communities. But one thing that was really stunning, the city of Chicago had a large number, hundreds of thousands of African Americans leaving the Deep South and moving to Chicago in the years just before the pandemic. Before the pandemic even hits, the Commissioner of Health is talking about these people as dangerous and dirty. And so when the pandemic hits, he essentially blames them for the pandemic in Chicago. Of course, there's no way in which the Black community in Chicago is responsible for what happened in that city, but they take the blame simply because they're perceived through a cultural lens of white supremacy. And you can only imagine then the kinds of treatment that they got and whether or not they had access to adequate resources, certainly not under that kind of administration.
Yeah, and I mean, it is really interesting to be talking to you about this today, given what's happening in America today, this convergence of the pandemic and the global anti-racist movement. And I suppose it'd be interesting, you know, maybe to reflect on this in a bigger way. But I do think that maybe there's an opportunity here with some optimism to have be a force for real change. Both of those things coming together, because it certainly didn't result in large-scale change after the 1918 pandemic.
It's hard not to be hopeful, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really lovely that you raised that, because as difficult as it is for us to sit with the violence that was visited on George Floyd, and that is what this movement is about today, there was nothing new about that violence. And the fact that now people are seeing it because it's happening alongside the inequities of the COVID pandemic, I think it is a reason for real hope that people that I know who prior to this simply weren't interested in issues of race are now, as they say, all in. Now, what that will mean over the long haul, I don't know, but you're right. It's a reason for optimism. Yeah.
No, we've had the same thing. We've had a lot of conversations about this at PARC, obviously, and we run the spectrum of cautious optimism and continued skepticism. So maybe we could talk a little bit about another topic that we talk about a great deal at PARC, and candidly have seen some increases in our own social media space and so on. That is the impact of misinformation. And so it would be really interesting, I think, for people to hear how that, I mean, clearly very different world, not connected in the same way at all, but that played out in 1918. And so it would be super to hear from you on that.
And what's interesting in 1918, and here I want to cut them some slack, something I think I did inadequately when I was writing my book. I have so much new sympathy for them. Is that the misinformation has a very different tenor in 1918. First of all, because the nation is at war, there's actually a fairly serious commitment to fighting the pandemic. To not fight the pandemic was to be unpatriotic. So to spread misinformation was not something that people would do with any intentionality. The reality is that their science simply isn't at the same level. They cannot yet see a virus. So they are having to guess about what's taking place. So do the newspapers publish some pretty crazy theories? Yeah, the role of Jupiter and Saturn in causing it, or sunspots. Yeah, those are stories that are out there. Do I fault them in the same way that I would fault people today? No, because again, public health was still in its infancy. Medicine was quite advanced, but not where it is today because they couldn't see a virus. They couldn't create a vaccine as a result. And so the misinformation was sometimes simply people being frightened and not having adequate information. I think what's really important about 1918 is that I think sometimes the misinformation that I would fault is when leadership wasn't willing to really speak to the issues at hand and to be open and direct and to share what they did know and understand well. And for me, that's the problem with the misinformation I'm hearing now, which is it is simply irresponsible to not take advantage of the great expertise that's out there and to share adequate, correct, honest, complete information to the public, and that anyone would do otherwise is reprehensible.
Well, that's yeah. The notion of leadership and speaking effectively to the issue at hand is one that we should talk a little bit about. Maybe we can talk broadly about the role of government intervention, and talk also specifically about leadership. So I recall that you noted that as the epidemic waned, so too did American appetite for government intervention in their daily lives. Can you follow up on what we can learn from that today? There seems to be at least a body of literature that I've read from, you know, not necessarily the most progressive places, but like McKinsey and companies, some of the other consulting organizations that are talking about the role of government, and that this is something we should now anticipate, is that there'll be a greater expectation for government to take a role in our lives. That clearly didn't happen before, and I'm sort of interested in how do we think it could happen today, and will it?
And you know me, I'm not going to prognosticate, but could it? I will say I hope. In 1918, it's really quite shocking how little is done in the aftermath, the ways in which there is not a willingness to concede that one of the things we learn is without adequate national organization, without a strong public health system, without access to adequate health resources for people regardless of their economic standing, that we will suffer through a pandemic desperately. There was a difficult or a terrific lack of leadership. We can talk about that in a minute. But what's interesting is that in the aftermath, the nation really moved away from federal intervention. Now, they had been through a 20-year reform period called progressivism that had given birth to a kind of federal intervention they had not experienced in generations, or had never, in a sense, when we come to things like a federal income tax. In turn, because of the war, people had their lives interfered with as well, whether those 4 million people who go off to war, many of whom were draftees, or the Committee on Public Information, which is a propaganda agency during the war. Americans had suffered, in a sense, under quite a bit of government authority during the war, and they were tired of it. They were tired of the war as well. What they wanted was a good economy and the chance to just do what they wanted to do. And they turned to people like Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge to do so, two presidents who had no interest in federal government and believed that, you know, the government that governs least governs best. That's where the nation went after 1918. And so when I hear federal leaders saying things like, well, we just need to put this behind us as soon as we can, we need to get on with our lives, I think it's a really wrong-headed approach to where we are.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to hear that counter. It was what seems certainly to me to be counterintuitive when you see the implications today of not only the different state approach in the United States, but to the pandemic. It seems to me that, you know, the call for some collective guidance, some broader leadership at that federal level would be an easy one. And when I read in the book that clearly hadn't happened, the distinctiveness, of course, is that they had been through that era of progressivism, and maybe that was enough to remove them from that interest in federal oversight.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit, because I want to watch our time and I'd really like to get into one or two other topics, but could you talk a little bit about the war and maybe the war and leadership, reflect on the leadership that you saw from a war effort as opposed to the pandemic?
And that's such an important part of what was happening in 1918 is because it was a nation at war, the federal attention really was on prosecuting the war and winning the war. If the pandemic is really at its worst in most states in October, remember that Armistice Day is November 11th. So we're in the very last moments of the war. So President Wilson has absolutely no interest in talking about the pandemic. He does not halt the Liberty Loan parades, which are taking place in the last week of September, which is just at the moment, right, that the influenza is landing. So that's the first bad move, where the war is placed ahead of the public's health. And then in turn, they don't want to slow down the troop movements because, again, they want the boys over in Europe. So again, helping to spread the pandemic, again, putting the war ahead of the health of not only the soldiers, but the civilians in the nation as well. And then finally, Wilson literally never speaks openly of the pandemic in 1918. He is that preoccupied by the war that he does not want to distract Americans. And so it's a complete absence, in a sense, of national leadership, leaving it then to the states, the counties, and the local areas to handle the pandemic. And I'm guessing that's starting to sound familiar to our listeners.
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the reasons it was referred to as the Spanish flu, was because, if I recall correctly, the Spanish weren't in the war, and so they had to acknowledge the challenge, and they had to work to address it. That's right? That's
exactly right, and it speaks really directly to the ways in which we can really mislabel and misunderstand things, and why we need to be so cautious about how we talk about this pandemic, which continues to be unclear in terms of its origins in some ways, and the ways in which misnaming or even just wanting to lay blame in a sense through naming is a really dangerous thing to do.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got quite a few questions coming in, and so let's deal with maybe what I think is one of the most revealing themes of the book, and we'll make this the last main theme, and then we'll take some questions. You know, this is the notion of national forgetting and a personal remembering, that the pandemic required Americans to accept a narrative of vulnerability and weakness that contradicted their view of themselves. Talk about that.
I'm afraid that's right, that I think the reason it is forgotten is that it's very easily subsumed under the story of World War I. But of course, it wasn't the war. It was a separate story. And in fact, far more people died in the pandemic than died in the war. So why would Americans remember one and not the other? World War I was an event in the American past that fits with the narrative Americans want to tell about themselves. It's referred to as American exceptionalism, which is to say, we're different from the rest of the world. We're healthier, we're smarter, we're stronger, and we're always progressing. We were born perfect and we're still getting better. That's the American narrative in some ways. And it's the one that turns up, I think, still in some of our history books. The story of the pandemic was a very different one. We were just like everyone else. We could not protect ourselves from this. We failed to protect the most vulnerable among us, failing our most essential public narrative about a democracy. And so to remember the pandemic would have required some real reckoning that the nation simply wasn't willing to do. That comes as no surprise, of course, because our nation has never reckoned with those things that my colleague and friend Ed Linenthal refers to, the fish bones that stick in our throats, those parts of our history that we know they're there, they nag at us, but we're not going to acknowledge them. And you can think of everything from slavery to Japanese American incarceration during World War II. There's a long, long list, the story of genocide against the indigenous peoples. We're not a nation that is very good at reckoning with the realities of our past.
Well, and I mean, the notion that whoever is narrating the history, who controls the language, controls the perspective and the debate, and of course that reinforces all of the inequity and the power structures that we've talked about.
That's right.
How do you see us learning from that to change that today? Because we're right at that point now where we're clearly continue to be in the midst of the pandemic, but as we move through it, there needs to be a sense that we can understand those vulnerabilities in order to address them. And I don't think we're that far away from people really needing to and wanting to get to that stage. So how can we think about that today?
When that actually is a place where I do have optimism. Now I'll concede the point, I'm a hopeless optimist. But I think part of what happened with 1918 is, as you say, those who were writing the histories were in a sense those who held the pen, those who had the power. And they told a story initially of the pandemic as a sort of democratic moment, which is simply untrue. The people who had experienced the realities of the pandemic, the poor, people of color, the most disenfranchised, weren't telling the story back then. That's changed. It's not completely changed, but the discipline of history as a result of the civil rights movement and all of the movements that came in its wake has really changed our discipline. And so there is a much greater attention to the telling of the stories of all the people that make up the United States, of all the people that make up the globe. And that's a real difference from where they were 100 years ago. And it gives me great optimism. If we can democratize storytelling, then we can have the capacity to really remember. And one indication that gives me great hope is how quickly archivists at universities around the nation, and I'm guessing this is happening around the world, began corresponding with one another and figuring out how to develop programs to save the stories. And every interview I've done, not every interview, but several of the interviews I've done in fora like this, one of the questions has been, well, how do we keep track of the memory? And the answer is simply write it, paint it, take pictures of it. Do whatever you need to do, but record it and tell everyone you know to record it in whatever way they can. And if everyone does that, we'll have access to those stories in the future and be able to tell the story properly. And I also think that even just looking at the journalism that's been done during this pandemic, a lot of people are doing important work to get the stories in front of the American public about, for instance, the reality that research is showing that African Americans are dying at 3.5 times the rate of white Americans if you adjust for age. That kind of information is actually out there in the public media now, and that's very different from where we were in 1918. So can we do better with that? That's one area where I feel pretty confident we can. Will we take care of the broader changes that we need to do? I think those are harder questions.
Oh, that's a real, it's really heartening to hear the way you frame that. I think it's a real call to action, certainly for groups like mine inside PATH that are really focused on understanding the stories, understanding the impact, understanding how to best transmit and relay that to others in an educational and informative manner. And so I know there'll be many of my team and colleagues will be heartened to hear that there is such importance and value in the work that we do as narrators of the current environment. One thing that stuck out to me in the book that I really particularly liked, because I was born and grew up in the United Kingdom, and so at the height of the AIDS epidemic, I was in Britain, and I heard about the quilt, the AIDS quilt. It became something that I became familiar with, but I really didn't understand it as a vehicle for that sort of narrative, that focus on kind of collective memory. And imperfect and problematic as it was, and you point that out in the book, it was capable of helping a national remembering.
Yeah, and what I think it helped to do is it allowed the private remembering that is always going on. Those who are grieving don't forget. They didn't forget after 1918. They don't forget in the midst of the AIDS crisis. They're not forgetting in the midst of COVID-19. But what the AIDS quilt made possible was the public recognition of that private suffering and grieving. And that, I think, is a really important part of what happens after a pandemic, which is there will be many, many people among us who will have suffered, and there will be others of us who have not. What the AIDS quilt made possible, I think, was drawing the public attention, the public conversation back to that private suffering that is going on, And we know that in the aftermath of trauma, one of the things that can help a person rebuild a life, a new life, a different life, but a full life, is the opportunity to tell your story and be heard, to have people listen to your story. And so I think one of the things we'll be called to do in the aftermath, as you're already suggesting, is to listen to those stories around the world, not just here in the United States, but the global stories, because they will tell us all the things we need to know if we're going to make the next one of these different.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think that's a great call to action. It has certainly caused me to reflect on, in the new environment where we have such, tremendous digital assets, we have such a network of social media. How could we really leverage that to create those avenues for that remembering at a global level? And is there a call to action around that could be compelling for PATH and other large institutions? So just know that you've caused me, when I'm out walking my dog, to think about some of these creative ideas that might help move this forward. So we've got a number of questions. I'm going to just turn here to have a look at some of those, and then we'll wrap up to bring us in on time here. Okay, so this is a question that I had anticipated. Actually, I think you and I talked about it when we were preparing. Mask wearing seems like a basic health protection and precaution, and has become very politicized today. Was that the case in 1918?
It was and it wasn't. Certainly people didn't care for masks then either. They also found them stuffy. There were also people who claimed that it was unconstitutional to require us to wear them. The difference between 1918 and today is that in 1918, they didn't know that masks do what they do. They couldn't know for certain that they would prevent the droplet infection, that they actually serve this role of protecting others. We don't wear them to protect ourselves, but to protect others. In 1918, the struggles would often be around a second imposition of mask wearing. This problem that we're already seeing now, I think, which is as we come through the first wave or the first spike, whichever it is, and then enter into a renewed or a resurgence of disease, people get really frustrated. And that's when there are often real outcries about not wearing a mask, when the anti-mask organization is founded down in San Francisco, for instance. What's different today is the way in which it's being politicized, and yet we know today that it works. And so for me, it's a really different circumstance. And again, why I have much more sympathy for the folks from 1918, because they had been told that these things would keep them from getting sick, and people got sick anyway. So why should I follow the rules that you're telling me? Well, today we understand things like flattening the curve. We know that wearing masks and social distancing won't prevent anyone from getting sick. People are still going to get sick, but we know that they make a difference. We know that if we wear them, we can help other people not get sick if we happen to be one of those persons who's asymptomatic or who is not yet showing symptoms. So that it's politicized today in the way that it is, for me, is shocking and deeply disturbing. And that it's happening from the very highest levels of my government is particularly disappointing.
Mm-hmm. We should know better. It's
You'd
the
think.
Summary there, I think, yeah. So a couple of questions. This is also a good one, and we didn't touch on it, mostly because we could have spent a whole session on this too. You talk a lot about race, how race and class impacted people's experiences with the pandemic. What about gender? And I recall you did some interesting research into that, and I think you had a letter from Amelia Earhart that you referenced, and yeah, so it'd be great to get your perspective on that.
Well, on the simplest levels, it does play out in terms of just basic performance of gender, as I'll describe it. So women were allowed to be afraid, whereas men were to be stoic. So Amelia Earhart writes this wonderful letter, and here she is, one of the bravest women alive, writes a letter to her friend saying, I fear it somehow more than a little. She's terrified of the flu. She's seen what it does in a flu ward, and she's willing to say it. Whereas a man has to write letters. And I read so many of these from soldiers, and they have to say things like, I don't have it, I'm never going to get it. And if I do, I'm just going to kick it in the pants. Because they had to perform this sort of male security, it plays out in some much more difficult ways, because that means that women can express grief in a way that men cannot in many cases. It also means that women are called on to be nurses because they're naturally caregivers, and there was a real push for that. Women were sort of demanded that they should undertake that role. And then when you start thinking about the economy and men and women, and in an era in which a middle class or an upper working class family might have a woman at home, but if a male breadwinner is sickened, then the woman must go to work, and it would fracture then the sort of existing family structures. Similarly, if a woman died, often the children would be then given away to other family members, because sometimes it was perceived that men were either not capable or socially weren't sanctioned to raise children. So it plays in some ways that are kind of cute, but also in ways that were really costly for families, and really led to the shattering of some families.
One question here around interest in noting that in 1918, that fighting the pandemic was patriotic. And do you think the lack of unified approach today is because of a lack of unity, misinformation, deliberate rejection? Sort of your sense on that?
It's really an interesting question, because in some ways the responses feel so similar. Though they have a war in 1918, so the nation is theoretically unified, the handling of the pandemic is still completely scattershot, because there's no national leadership and an absence of preparation at the national level. And in some ways we're seeing that exact thing play out today. But yes, I think the fact that we are so disunified at this moment has not helped us. And in fact, it seems awful to say aloud, but I don't see how we can see otherwise, that divisiveness that has been, I think, encouraged from the very top, that has led to people, crying out for the liberation of their states from lockdown orders, or the politicizing of not wearing masks, is going to kill people. And for me, that's really tragic, that a willful politicization of basic public health measures has led us to a place where people are going to die as a result. And is that because we're so divided? I suppose, but I think you could also argue that you could have a really divided nation if you had real leadership at this moment. I think things would be better. I can imagine presidents who are also president in this same sort of community that's very divided. And I think, for instance, President Barack Obama would have actually done everything he could think of to unify the country around public health measures. And that's simply not what's happening in 2020.
Question here, and I know you're not an economist, so you'll tell me if you're not ready to answer this one. But it's really just around how you think the flu impacted the sort of famously short V-shaped recession post-war in 1920. Reflections on that?
It's a great question, and I wish I could give you a great answer, but I don't know the answer to it. I think one of the problems is the disaggregation. There, I can use a fancy word so I sound smart. The disaggregation of the data is very difficult to do, because we don't know which thing is affecting what happens in the economy, because we're also demobilizing from the war at the same moment. So the European economies are beginning to open up again. The United States is suffering from that post-war, economic downturn. We have a lot of troops coming home all at once, and the pandemic happening at the same time. And I don't know how to pull those two things apart. I'm sure there are some good economic historians who are trying to figure that out literally as we speak, because it's a question that's on a lot of people's minds right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on the nature of data, what, maybe just at a high level, what was the availability and reliability of data to help inform best practices or sort of policies, etc., during 1918 pandemic?
Yeah, the data just wasn't like it is today. Again, because they couldn't see the virus, because it wasn't a reportable disease in a lot of communities initially around the world, especially. The data is not very good in an isolated sense, but it does tell us something about certain practices that we know work. So information about public health measures like social distancing and the closure of public spaces is really quite clear, because you can look at a really broad swath of cities across the United States, and researchers at the CDC and at the University of Michigan, historians there have worked together to do really extensive and deep research on looking at those communities that put in place these basic public health measures early, sustained them for a long time, and enforced them with some rigor, that they just had they had lower death rates. And the important side note or addendum to that is that those communities also had a faster economic recovery because they were not as destabilized as a result of mortality. So the data is sketchy. We can't figure out a lot of things, but some of these big questions are easily answered. Does social distancing work? Yes. Yeah. No, that's great. We're almost at time here, so I might just wrap up, and then I'll give you the last word here. In the conclusion of your book, there's a couple of reflections that I'd like to share. One is that, you know, we turn to scientists to determine how to contain disease. We turn to public health professionals to educate, and it's left to other humans to reflect and understand the human lessons of the pandemic. And what's, I think, from my perspective, so important to remember is that today we do, in fact, have the benefits of information. We do have data, better data. We do have the experience of the 1918 pandemic, and it is incumbent upon us to actually reflect that, to remember that, to learn from that. Your last words in the book are, should we face such an eventuality, i.e. another pandemic, let us prove better prepared to admit to a tale of sorrow and loss, to acknowledge the trauma and tragedy that is left in its wake, and provide the support and understanding to sufferers that they need. You wrote that, I think, in 2012, certainly earlier than today. Just to conclude, how do you reflect on that now? And you've pointed to a couple of areas of optimism. Any others that you might reflect on as we wrap? Yeah. Well, I think if I had it to say over again, I wouldn't leave it only to our government officials or our public health leaders to make the decisions. In fact, given the absence of sound political leadership that we've seen, not just in the United States, but in other countries around the globe as well, that I think we're in a different era when our voices matter in new ways. And I'm optimistic about the ways in which, as we were talking about earlier, this movement for racial justice in the United States, that Black Lives Matter, is really morphing into an international movement that is calling not only for the well-being of Black people around the globe, but also recognizing the ways in which that has really expansive meaning for the well-being of all people. And I'm not saying all lives matter. What I'm saying is if we can truly make Black lives matter, the benefits will accrue to all of us. And so the fact that we're living in the midst of Black Lives Matter at this moment makes me believe that people can call out not only to remember one another's grief and to be there for one another, but also to make the demands for better preparation in the future, for a redistribution of resources so that everyone has equitable access to healthcare, so that organizations like yours can be fully supported to do the kind of work that needs to be done in the United States, but globally as well. And I'm optimistic that given the ways in which we now are so much more interconnected globally, that we have an opportunity, each of us as global citizens, to use our voices to make demands for things to be different after this one. And that gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, I'm delighted to have talked to you today. That's a great spot to end the conversation. Thank you very deeply for the work that you do, the tremendous research and consideration that you've given this topic, and thank you for a really informative and, I think, hopeful conversation that's given us a couple of ideas and some opportunities for action. And I hope this won't be the last time that we have an opportunity to engage you and to interact with you. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Really, the thanks go right back to you, Elena, to PATH and everyone that works with you and for you. The work you do is so important. And for me, it's really just an honor to be alongside you for this brief hour. Please continue the wonderful work that you do, and thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. We'll keep the conversation going. And thank you all very much for joining. Thank you for the questions. And as I mentioned at the outset, we will endeavor to continue to reflect on these topics and answer questions that we didn't get to today. So thank you all very much for joining, and we'll conclude the event now. Bye-bye.